They want to scare you and make you think that you're not going to get your Social Security. So if you're on Social Security, if you're on Medicare, Medicaid, you are protected by law. The only ones that can change how much you get from Social Security, or if you stop getting Social Security, it's the Congress of the United States of America. Hello, YouTubers. Alaska Prepper here. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want you to worry about your Social Security payments should we not raise the debt ceiling in time. Meaning that all of the fear-mongering that is going on by Janet Yellen, all of the government pundits, in addition to the mainstream media pundits, is exactly that. Fear porn, so that you can be afraid, especially if you get Social Security now and you depend on it to live, so that you can be afraid and so that you can tell your representatives, we need to raise the debt ceiling. It is a lie. And I am going to show you why, and hopefully you will do your own research so that you know you don't have to worry that this raising of the debt ceiling is only a way for them to continue to borrow to spend on deficit spending, which is exactly what borrowing is. It's deficit spending. And most of the deficit spending, if not all, that we here in the United States commit to, i.e. the government, is spending that's really not needed. It's spending that they use to send money to other countries. It's spending that they use to pay for people that maybe shouldn't be here. It's spending that they use to find out whether a fish mates better when on cocaine than not. Pretty much boondoggles. That's what all of the deficit spending comes down to, is government boondoggles that wastes money at the expense of the American people. Before I continue, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you very much to Genesis Gold Group for sponsoring this video. Let me tell you something. Knowledge is power. And right now in the United States of America, I believe we have like 60-something million retirees that are collecting Social Security. That's a lot of people to be collecting on a program that is bankrupt. Not because of them, not because there's so many people collecting it, but because the government in years past pretty much took all of the surplus that was in the Social Security Trust and spent it. But I digress, ladies and gentlemen. The fact of the matter is this, is that the media, the government, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, whoever it is that's talking about that, oh my goodness, Social Security and Medicare and this and that is going to have to stop if we don't reach a debt ceiling, if they don't reach some kind of agreement on the debt ceiling. That is a complete lie. And why do I say that knowledge is power? Because they're expecting, by telling you these lies, they're expecting for 60+ million Americans who are receiving Social Security to be in an uproar and tell their representatives, you have to get a debt ceiling passed. You must. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality and the fact of the matter is that the debt ceiling has nothing to do with Social Security. It has nothing to do with Medicare. And I've acquired here a couple articles that I'm going to read to you briefly, and I'm going to leave the link to all of these articles on a pinned comment so that you can revisit them yourselves. Please do your own research. Please, understand that if you don't look at this stuff yourself, you're going to fall for the same thing that you've always fallen for. And what's that? For lies that come out of people that do not care about you. I'm trying not to get excited, but this really does bother me. How many of you out there really think that Janet Yellen cares about you? She is lying to you when she says we may have to cut off Social Security. She cannot do that. She cannot do that. Social Security and Medicare are protected by law. They are called mandatory spending, mandatory expenditures. They have to be paid first and foremost. So if you're on Social Security, if you're on Medicare, Medicaid, you are protected by law. The only ones that can change how much you get from Social Security, or if you stop getting Social Security, is the Congress of the United States of America. And they're not going to do that. You know why they're not going to change your Social Security benefits? Even if we don't reach a deal with the debt ceiling, ladies and gentlemen? Because all of these politicians, they're whores. They are whores. And they will not change it, not because they care about you, but because they want your vote. That's why they won't change it. And Janet Yellen and all of these media people going out there saying, oh my goodness, you're going to lose your Social Security. They're trying to make you afraid so that you can do something that you otherwise would not have done. We as a people, we are strong, but we are only strong if we are informed. Let me stop talking and let me go ahead and read a couple of these little excerpts for you. Now, this article right here says why Biden cannot use the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling. We're not going to talk about the 14th Amendment, but we are going to talk about this part here that I highlighted. Not raising the debt limit means, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Balancing the budget. It's just like your household. If you make $5,000 a month, you have to stay within that budget unless you're borrowing in excess of what you make in a month, and then that's money you're going to have to pay back. But if you cannot borrow any further and you're bringing in $5,000 a month, it just means that you can't spend more than $5,000 a month on all of your expenses. So if there were some things that you were doing, like maybe donating to this or giving to that, then you can no longer do it because that would exceed your $5,000 a month. Same thing with the U.S. government. If right now they are doing things like giving to this country, giving to these people, giving to this organization, etc., it just means that anything above what the U.S. government is bringing in the case of the government, since they don't produce anything, they bring in taxes from we the people, they can't spend anything above that. Same thing with you. If you only bring in $5,000 a month and you can't borrow anymore because all of your credit cards are pretty much maxed out, then you can't borrow anymore. So you have to stick to spending what you have. Anyways, reading on. The debt limit is a law restricting how much the federal government may borrow. The current law says, they have a typo here, it says 34.4 trillion, it's 31.4 trillion. If Congress refuses to change the law, if Congress refuses to change the law, it will remain at 31.4 trillion. Borrowing more than that is illegal. Not only illegal, but unlawful. It's two different things. So the government will have to pay its debt obligations out of current revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, out of current revenue. I'm not a financial advisor, but the folks at Genesis Gold Group specialize in helping those who want to diversify their excess wealth by converting their fiat currency retirement plans into a plan that is backed by real money. So if you're in a position where you are wondering what you can do in order to diversify or insulate your wealth against what I like to call the inferno of inflation, give Genesis Gold Group a call, and they can provide you with the information that you need in order to make an educated decision. Once again, thank you very much, Genesis Gold Group, for sponsoring this video. The government collects taxes on a monthly basis. Every month there's new taxes pouring into the government. And so out of current revenue, that's all they have to spend. Okay? Could the federal government do that? Absolutely they can. Please, ladies and gentlemen, educate yourselves, especially if you're in the group of people that can really make change and scream at your representatives. They want to scare you. If you're on Social Security or one of these benefits, because Social Security is a benefit, you paid into that forcefully, I would say. They want to scare you and make you think that you're not going to get your Social Security. That's like number one on the list of what they have to pay as far as mandatory payments go. Current revenue is about 8 times current interest payments. And that's another thing, that it's not technically a mandatory expenditure, interest payments, but in a way it is. Because if they stop paying interest, then that's called a default. And the dollar will plummet and it'll be Armageddon. All right? We're eventually going to face that day. But hopefully it's not going to be here in a week or two. Some people say that hopefully it will be. But I say that the longer that we have, the better that we can get prepared, because it's going to happen either way. All right. So in other words, debt service is about 13% of revenue. Obviously, there is enough money coming in to pay existing debt while retaining most government services. Of course, the feds would have to trim other parts of the budget. I'm sure readers may have suggestions on that score, meaning stop funding all of these parts of your budget, federal government, that has nothing to do with the American people. Stop giving away our riches and stop giving away the labor of our current and future generations. And here they say these facts are no secret. We have reached earlier debt limits on many occasions, but there has never been a default. Why? Because they can make the interest payments with the money that they're bringing in from taxes. Mostly what happens is a few federal facilities close. When that happened last time, the feds closed Rocky Mountain National Park. No problem. The Colorado state government took over the job. Still, every time we approach a new debt limit, unscrupulous politicians and their media whores claim we're at risk of default. Why? So that you can be scared. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because you worked your lives in order to pay into a system so that you can have a retirement and have a little bit of maybe security in your older age. But now they want to scare you into thinking that that security is going to go away if this debt ceiling is not lifted. This is so partially false that we can only conclude that what concerns them isn't default, but something else. What is that something else, they say? And that is, ladies and gentlemen, what I've been talking about. That people learn that they don't need all that money to spend on all that crap that they spend on that has nothing to do with the American people. All right? They put it a lot better than me, saying that people might learn they don't really need all that exorbitant federal spending. That they might decide they like the budget being balanced. Let me finish this portion of the video with this. Key takeaways. Mandatory spending requires government's expenses on programs mandated by law. Okay? So what they're saying is that mandatory spending are laws that say you have to spend on this first. Okay? Social Security and Medicare are the largest mandatory spending programs the U.S. government has to pay for. So don't be afraid about your Social Security. Congress establishes the mandatory program. Only this body can reduce the mandatory expense budget. Congress is the only body that can change it. All right? And then if it passes Congress and the Senate, and then it gets signed by the President of the United States, then it becomes law. So they cannot take away your Social Security just because Janet Yellen is trying to scare you into pressuring your politicians into getting this debt ceiling raised. Ladies and gentlemen, raising the debt ceiling is just a way of the politicians and the government to cover its own ass. Has nothing to do with your well-being. None whatsoever. And the last bullet point here, interest on the national debt is not categorized as a mandatory expense, but as an obligation payment. It becomes part of mandatory spending. So like I said before, we have to pay the interest on our national debt. Why? Because as soon as we stop paying the interest, we default on the dollar. And then the dollar goes to nothing. And then the United States immediately, overnight, becomes a third world country. And I'm not being hyperbolic by saying that. And this article over here is from SHTF Plan. U.S. downfall, de-dollarization efforts are ramping up. It has nothing to do with the dollar being taken out of the world reserve currency. It's just that countries are deciding to de-dollarize, meaning that they're not spending dollars anymore. Therefore, they don't need dollars in their reserves. When they don't have dollars in their reserves, what happens to those dollars that they get rid of? They use it to buy something, and then eventually those dollars end up right back here in the United States, causing inflation. And one day we will see that inflation skyrocket because of just that. Because countries, ladies and gentlemen, are moving away from the dollar, whether we want to believe it or not. So the time to prepare is right now. Many major global economies are shifting away from the United States dollar, and the clues are there for those who know where to look. New sources of non-dollar finance are emerging. There are new bilateral agreements to trade and lend in currencies other than the US dollar. Even more importantly, major oil trade buyers and sellers, for example, Moscow and Riyadh, as much as Beijing and New Delhi, are agreeing to trade in non-dollar currencies. These deals are destroying one of the main pillars of dollar dominance since OPEC quadrupled and then doubled oil prices in the 1970s, giving countries around the world a major reason to demand and hold dollars. Ladies and gentlemen, now that countries are de-dollarizing, they don't have a reason to hold dollars anymore. They don't need to buy oil in dollars. When they no longer fear the might of the United States and say, hey, what are you going to do? Are you going to take us all out because we're not using the dollar? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a very rude awakening when you go to the store, and if you're lucky enough, you can find something that's imported. If you're lucky enough to find something that's imported, that you're lucky enough to even be able to afford it. In the United States especially, media outlets and analysts do not want to admit that the world is moving away from the dollar. Analysts keep writing it off as if the dollar's dominance remains intact. Of course, these arguments are based on all sorts of false assumptions. For instance, they claim the dollar will only continue dominating until another country's currency replaces it, or that it will only happen if other countries pursue forms of internationalization that mimic that of the US dollar today. But there's no other reserve currency declared by the overlords of Earth, and yet nations are still creating other currencies that will compete. And what he's saying there is what I explained earlier, that there doesn't have to be another reserve currency in order for the dollar to fall, because nations will just refuse to use it. And we have some good news, ladies and gentlemen, for Alaska. Alaska House passes bill to make gold and silver legal tender. And more states are falling in line with this thought process. And that is the process of thinking that, hey, what are we going to do as a state when these dollars that we are forced to use in commerce are either worth less or worth nothing at all? So this Alaska is obviously not the first state to do this. It won't be the last state. Another piece of good news over in Zimbabwe. Despite IMF rebuke, Zimbabwe sells $14 million in gold-backed digital tokens in its first issue. From what I understand, they actually have the gold and you can exchange the digital tokens for gold. I think that's how it works. I could be wrong, but this is a good move. Not 100% just because of the gold, but because a small country, and I think it's key, that a small country has decided to say to this huge power that is the IMF, no, we're not going to do what you're telling us to do. We're going to do what's best for our country. 2 weeks ago, we described Zimbabwe's latest effort to stabilize the local currency from continued depreciation against the US dollar. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe introduced a gold-backed digital currency to serve as legal tender in their country. By the way of background, Zimbabwe has been fighting against currency volatility and inflation for over a decade, and I think we all know that. Back in 2009, the country adopted the US dollar as its currency after an episode with hyperinflation, and in 2019, the Zimbabwean dollar was reintroduced in an effort to revive the country's struggling economy. Last year, the government decided to use the dollar again in a bid to curb surging prices in the country. And now the central bank's latest plan will allow small amounts of Zimbabwean dollars to be exchanged for the digital gold token, enabling more Zimbabweans to hedge against currency volatility. Ladies and gentlemen, governments have done this throughout history. They've done everything that doesn't work, and then they finally end up doing what does work. And why is that? Because usually what does work, is usually what's fair. It's usually what's just. It's usually what's moral. And man, when he's given power, it usually takes that power to do it for self-serving things instead of thinking of their people. So every several generations, we have to return to the cycle and start it all over again. And the cycle always starts with gold and silver being money. That's what's going to happen here in the United States. That's what's going to happen everywhere around the world. How long will it take? I don't know. But eventually we will get there. Because eventually there will be enough suffering where the people are going to be like, that's enough. We've had enough. We need real money. We need something that doesn't steal our wealth. And government has to get smaller in order for us to do that. And government has to be readjusted in a way that it will do what it was meant to do, at least here in the United States of America. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, there's a whole bunch of other things that we can say about this. I probably made this video a little too long, but I hope you get something out of this. Don't get scared about Social Security. If you're on Social Security, please don't get scared and understand that it is not at risk. As long as people in America are still working and taxes are being extorted from them, then your Social Security will be paid for. It's the #1 thing on the list that has to be paid for. So don't be scared and do the right thing. All right, do the right thing, not only for yourselves, but do the right thing for the generations that are coming ahead of us, or coming after us, excuse me. Having said that, have a great day. Thank you again, Genesis Gold Group, for sponsoring this video. God bless every one of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alaska Prepper. I'm out.